Terrence Malick's 1998 war epic, the counterpart to Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, is an unusual war film to say the least. Over its almost 3-hour runtime, we spend more time immersed in personal reflections of soldiers, NCOs, and officers than we do watching firefights. This war art film, as some call it, is still backed up with some serious firepower, but the World War II era firearms take a step back behind the poetry and the larger meditation of life that's presented in the movie. Many viewers despise the movie because of this, but there are very few movies that paint a better picture of how cruel, unforgiving, and dehumanizing war really is. In this video, we'll be giving the spotlight to the guns that took a backseat in the thin red line. The M1 Garand, which can also be pronounced Garand depending on who you ask, is by far the most prominent firearm in the movie. And if you're just now getting into World War II media, prepare to see a whole lot of it because this was the standard US service rifle during the Second World War. After starting production at Springfield Armory in 1934, almost 5.5 million units were built over a 23-year period, and in 1936, the M1 Garand replaced the M1903 Springfield as the United States service rifle. The M1 was named after its inventor, French-Canadian Jean Garand, also known as John Garand, who started working on it in the 1920s. It would take an entire decade to start mass-producing the gun, but the time was well spent because some of the features were revolutionary at the time. For example, it was the first self-loading standard-issue rifle in the US military. Self-loading means that the rifle uses a portion of the energy created by firing to load another cartridge. This is standard today, but back in the day, soldiers had to manually chamber the next round. M1's predecessor as the standard US service rifle was the M1903 Springfield, which was a rifle with a much lower rate of fire because of its bolt-action mechanism. The M1903 was also in service during the Second World War, mind you, but not as the standard service rifle. It also makes an appearance in the longer cut of the movie, but is limited to only a cameo. The 30-06 Springfield cartridges are fed into the Garand via an 8-round clip, which made reloading fairly easy. When the shooter would fire the last round, the clip would be ejected and the bolt would be locked open, waiting to be fed again. Dubbed the greatest battle implement ever devised by none other than General Patton himself, the M1 Garand was a much faster firing rifle in comparison to its German and Japanese counterparts during the Second World War. This, in return, prompted Axis powers to increase their production of semi-auto and automatic firearms to level the playing field that was, at least in this regard, tilted in American favor. Aside from just shooting fast, soldiers praised the M1's accuracy and durability. General Douglas MacArthur reported that under combat conditions, it operated with no mechanical defects and when used in foxholes did not develop stoppages from dust or dirt. It has been in almost constant action for as much as a week without cleaning or lubrication. The M1 was also famous for biting its users' thumbs, an injury we know today as Garand thumb. There's a saying among gun enthusiasts that there are only two types of Garand shooters, those who already got a Garand thumb and those who will. This nasty injury can be avoided by simply being careful. It usually occurs when the shooter doesn't pull the operating rod far back enough to lock the bolt in place. Instead of locking down, the bolt rests on the follower with only the friction that the connection creates, keeping it from lunging forward with a lot of pent-up aggression. When the shooter touches the follower or even just shakes his M1, the bolt launches itself forward, hammering the shooter's thumb with enough force to make a grown man cry. To avoid this, just make sure that the bolt is locked in place every time you pull the operating rod. This is, of course, easier said than done in the heat of battle though, which is why it happened fairly often during the war. The gun was used for a long time after the Second World War. They were somewhat used in the Korean War and even in Vietnam, despite the adoption of the M14 in 1958. Surplus guns were provided as foreign aid to American allies, ranging from South Korea and West Germany to Turkey, the Philippines, and other places. Even today, the M1 is still used for ceremonial purposes all over the world. However, since it was so widespread, it was also used by the Taliban during the war in Afghanistan, and even some German units that captured M1s used them against American forces. The M1 was phased out after a long and faithful service, garnering the reputation of a reliable firearm, forever etching itself on the pages of American military history. Unlike Saving Private Ryan, which is a much more dynamic war movie, the M1 Garands in the thin red line are subdued, their existence almost completely irrelevant as the movie itself is not about combat, but about what it does to a man. Does the Garand feel too muted for your taste when compared to other World War II films? Let us know in the comments. Despite that, the gun is still depicted accurately and fairly. What's not depicted properly is the M1 Carbine, at least possibly improperly depicted. The M1 Carbine, just to clarify, is not a carbine version of the M1 Garand, but at the time of its design, the Army started using the letter M as a designation for model, and M1 Carbine stands for the first carbine model developed under this system. Now, The Thin Red Line is a movie about the Battle of Mount Austin, part of the Guadalcanal campaign. To this very day, historians and lovers of military history can't agree whether the M1 Carbine actually made it to Guadalcanal in time for the battle. There's a lot of evidence supporting the claim that the gun never saw combat in Guadalcanal, but a lot of people claim that their grandpas actually used it. What are your thoughts though? Is there any reason to believe that the M1 Carbine really was used in Guadalcanal? Leave your opinion in the comments below. The official documented stance is that carbines never made it there on time, and that gap was temporarily plugged with the Rising M50 and M55 submachine guns, Thompsons, and M1911A1 handguns. The gun is actually pretty common in the movie, which is anachronistic, and we'll be deducting points for that. The BAR is, unfortunately, not as prominent in the movie as it should be. We only really get to see a close-up of it on one occasion, but we don't see it in use, nor do we see a lot of it, which is weird because this was the standard squad light machine gun at the time. In the movie, the designated operator is Private Seiko, who fakes sickness to avoid combat and is taken by Corporal Queen. The BAR is a big gun. The A2 variant we see in the movie weighs around 19 pounds, and it's overall 47.8 inches long with a 24-inch barrel. It's chambered for the same caliber as the M1 Garand, the 30-06 Springfield, and the rounds are stacked in a 20-round magazine. The A2 variant is also known as the World War II variant because it was adopted in 1940, and since 250,000 were produced, it's by far the most common BAR variant. It has a fire select option that allows the operator to choose between the standard and reduced rate of fire, with the gun firing up to 650 RPM during standard action and up to 450 RPM during slow action. The BAR, however, had a few disadvantages in comparison to the British Bren and the Japanese Type 96. It had a small magazine capacity of only 20 rounds, which an operator can go through incredibly quickly in the heat of battle, and the rate-reducing mechanism caused malfunctions if the operator didn't clean it well enough. The BAR is nevertheless an icon of the Second World War, as it was the designated light machine gun for each squad. Even though every soldier was trained how to operate it on a basic level, infantry companies usually had designated operators. Although a machine gun is best operated from a prone position, the bipod was often taken off by operators in the field because it was deemed too heavy, and it made the gun difficult to move around. This was especially common in the Pacific Theater. Throughout the course of war, however, the BAR greatly affected military tactics despite its technical shortcomings. At the beginning of the war, the general plan of small unit tactics was for the BAR to support M1 Garand carrying riflemen in the attack with a base of fire. German troops, however, had more automatic firearms per unit, with every 4th German soldier equipped with an automatic weapon, as opposed to every 12th man in American squads. This prompted a change in tactics. The Army started issuing 2 BARs per a 12-man squad, with 2 designated fire teams per squad. One team would wait as the other team laid down covering fire, and when the firing team emptied their mag, the other team would open fire with their BAR. That way, American troops circumvented the problem of limited magazines and a limited fire capacity. The Marines also increased the number of BARs. In 1943, there were 513 per division, and that number rose to 867 per division by the end of the war. Squads also grew to 13 men with 3 fire teams, each consisting of 4 men, with 1 BAR per fire team. That way, each squad had 3 BARs. This is actually acknowledged in the movie, which is pretty cool, as Sergeant Macron says that he lost his entire squad, all 12 men.
I lost all 12. I lost all 12.
Unfortunately, the BAR is underrepresented in the Thin Red Line. It makes very few appearances, and we don't even see it fire, which is a travesty. We do get to see a lot of the Thompson though. As explained earlier, Thompson is one of the guns used in place of the M1 Carbine. This gun weighs in at 10.8 pounds and it's 33.7 inches long with a 12-inch barrel. It fires 45 ACP rounds at a rate of up to 725 per minute up to 500 feet effectively. More than 1.5 million Thompson guns were produced during this war, and this includes the M1 and M1A1, which we don't see in this movie as the specific variant used in the movie is the M1928A1. In comparison to the original 1928 model, the A1 has no vertical foregrip and it came with a hook for a sling. The 12-inch barrel is only that long because of the Cut's muzzle brake. Thompson barrels are usually about 10.5 inches long. The iconic drum magazine, which is and always will be affiliated with Prohibition-era gangsters, was not used. Although it was initially issued, troops didn't like it because it was prone to jamming and rattled when moving, so it was eventually phased out. Aside from NCOs, Thompson was a weapon for commissioned officers, scouts, patrol leaders, and soldiers performing raids. It was especially useful to special operations forces because of its high rate of fire and stopping rate, which made it deadly in close quarters. The gun was beloved by its users, and those who managed to get their hands on it usually never let go of it. This is ironic because the US military was originally not very interested in the Thompson. It was first used by the Marines in 1926 when the US Postmaster General purchased 200 Thompsons to help them fight off armed mail robbers. Yup, DoorDash thieves existed back then too. This Thompson was the 1921 model, and the Marines apparently loved them and used them in the 20s and 30s, but the Army was still disinterested. That is, until war broke out, and in 1941, concrete plans were made for the mass production of the Thompson M1928A1. Later in the war, the M1A1 would start production, which was further refined, and nowadays all variants of the Thompson are highly sought after. Because the guns are so beautiful, and taking into account their history in both the Second World War and gangster wars in the United States, they can achieve quite a price at auctions. A 1921A model, believed to be owned by Bonnie and Clyde, albeit without documentation to back that claim up, was sold in 2012 for $130,000. In 2024, both 1928 and 1921 models were sold for anything from $25,000 to $45,000, depending on how well kept the gun is. Rick from Pawn Stars will still only give you $17 though. In the thin red line, the gun is appropriately used mostly by NCOs, with a private picking it up every now and again, and the gun's portrayal is largely accurate. Like every other gun in this movie, its use is kind of shoved in the background as this movie isn't actually about guns, no matter how many of them appear over the 3-hour-long film. There are many other weapons that make smaller appearances in the movie. The Colt M1911A1, for example, is the topic of conversation at the beginning of the movie when Private First Class Dahl steals one. The M1911 is a legendary handgun because of its revolutionary design. It introduced the short recoil design on a grand scale, which is a common thing nowadays, but it was groundbreaking at the time. It wasn't, mind you, the first ever handgun that utilized short recoil operation. That title goes to the Colt M1900, but the M1911 was the first mass-produced short recoil handgun because only 4,200 M1900s were ever made, and the number of M1911s exceeds 4 million. Short recoil operation means that the barrel and the slide of the handgun unlock independently after firing. The expanding combustion gases give momentum to the slide, which moves to the rear with a claw extractor pulling the empty casing, and as the slide stops its motion to the back, it's propelled forward and chambers a new round from the magazine. This design might seem simple and logical nowadays, but it was something very few people had seen back in the day. It was way ahead of its time. On top of that, the M1911 is chambered for the 45 ACP cartridge with excellent stopping power. As is often the case with incredible firearms, it spread all over the world over time. It's still beloved by gun enthusiasts today, and it's still in use in the United States, Brazil, South Korea, Mexico, and many other countries. Another weapon we see used is the M1A1 Flamethrower, which is the same flamethrower used in Saving Private Ryan. About 13,000 of these were made, and even though they were eventually replaced by the M2 Flamethrower, they were of considerable use during the Second World War. The M1A1 was revolutionary in its own way, since it was the first flamethrower to utilize napalm. Because of this, it had more than double the range of the M1 flamethrower at about 150 feet. This thing was heavy. It weighed about 70 pounds, and 2 people were needed to operate it properly. One of them was the operator, and the other person was opening the fuel valves, and it carried more fuel, tools, and weapons for both men. Flamethrowers were a great tool for clearing out bunkers, caves, and trenches, and as it's shown in the movie, for destroying enemy buildings. In the Pacific Theater, American troops often encountered complex Japanese underground tunnel systems, and smoking the enemy out was a favored tactic, and it was also used for clearing out dry brush. There are reported cases of the Japanese surrendering at the mere appearance of a flamethrower, which is a testament to its fantastic psychological power. A weapon that finds itself at the center of the movie's biggest incident is the Mark II hand grenade. We're not going to waste time on explaining how a grenade works. You pull the pin, it goes boom. To avoid accidental explosions, the pins were purposefully made difficult to pull out, and what happens in the movie is that Sergeant Keck straightens the fold of the pin on one of his grenades. This was often done by soldiers at the time to make it easier to pull the pin out. This proves to be a fatal mistake because later in the movie, Keck accidentally pulls the pin out while the grenade is still attached to his belt, which is just a hell of a way to ruin your day. This, as you'd expect, results in his death. Aside from that being a mistake, this incident itself is a writing mistake. Keck hooked the grenade on his belt by the lever, and when you pull the pin, the lever itself detaches from the grenade. If this had happened, the grenade in the movie would drop by Keck's feet. However, it somehow stays attached to his belt and blows up his behind. A wire was used to keep the grenade attached to the belt during filming. Also, if you're wondering why the grenades look like pineapples, it's because at the time they were painted bright yellow as an explosion warning. The final firearm we're going to mention is the iconic Winchester Model 1897 used by Corporal Queen. The trench sweeper, as it was often called, was incredibly effective in close combat, and Queen uses it specifically for that purpose. This 12-gauge pump-action shotgun is 39.25 inches long with a 20-inch barrel, and more than 1 million units were built in its 60-year production course. If you want the full breakdown of Japanese weapons used in the film, we have an extended video on that available on Patreon. We are going to give the Thin Red Line an overall 8 out of 10 for firearms accuracy. The most glaring mistake in the movie is the use of the M1 carbine, which didn't make an appearance in Guadalcanal, or it was at least never documented. There's also that grenade lever mistake that we just can't ignore. Aside from that, the arsenal shown in the movie is fairly accurate, even if it doesn't get a big enough role. The Thin Red Line might not be your favorite war movie. Most online comments are bashing it left, right, and center nowadays because of its painfully slow pacing and because it's more focused on the individual's interpretation of war rather than combat itself. However, it is one of the most unique, authentic war movies ever made. The guns here don't have much of a personality to them, and they don't play a role as large as they do in some other movies, but they're still major instruments of a larger story about men, mortality, and the indifference of nature to men's destruction. The real protagonist here isn't any gun, it's the grass, the silence, and the inevitability of death. What did you think of the Thin Red Line? Was it too slow for you, or did you find a way to appreciate it for what it is? Let us know in the comments below, and if you liked this video, like it, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.